Hello. Today, I'd like to try and ponder the question as to whether there is such a thing as what is normal under this broad term trans, this umbrella term. And sometimes we also speak, of course, of there being a gender spectrum, and people who identify as trans see themselves as not typically being strictly binary. In other words, conforming to appearance and identity and presentation as either female or male. Perhaps they identify as being of the gender, of those two genders, I should say, that are different to the sex they were born into, or they may flux between the two, or perhaps they identify themselves as being sitting somewhere on this spectrum, as is often called. Quite how we define that, probably at one end we can think in terms of ultra masculine, the other end ultra feminine, whatever those mean to you. And what criteria are used to define what falls between in terms of expression, in terms of identity, and so on. Again, is going to be very difficult to pin down and agree, as it were, a universal definition. So, is there such a thing as what we might call normal under this trans umbrella? I'm relying here on anecdotal evidence a lot, what I observe from forums I'm involved in, what I see online. There have been a number of surveys done on this as well, but they're not necessarily very definitive. But broadly, I guess there are two main categories we might pick out. There are those who are cross-streamers, and there are those who consider themselves to be either trans men or trans women. And to a greater or lesser degree, will want to present according to the gender opposite to that. They will want to present and embody the gender contrary to the gender they were born into. And that will include both those who are committed or go through with full sexual reassignment surgery, gender reassignment surgery, and those who don't. We might also add as another significant category, and these aren't strictly, I guess, under the trans umbrella, but quite often may find themselves with some form of gender dysphoria, those who are born intersex, in other words, with ambiguous genitalia, or with attributes or biology that, as it were, combines both masculine and feminine, and typically who will have been socialized in one gender, which may or may not be something that they are comfortable with as they come into adolescence and adult life. And some may identify as being trans as a result. So I think that's possibly another group that we may well consider here. Having said all this, there are a lot of people like me whose sexuality doesn't quite fit with the norm. In fact, it's really quite at odds with what a lot of what I read. Those of us, particularly, who consider ourselves to be gender fluid, or indeed to have a body dysphoria, which is also fluid. And I do distinguish between body dysphoria and gender dysphoria. They're two separate things, I think. I will try and explain my own sexuality in another video. I struggled with whether I should do that or not, because it's not the sort of thing that we usually do, go public on. But I think it's probably important that there are more voices out there from people like me who are very much in the background at the moment. And just to let people know that this is a very varied and rich ground, that the nature of sexuality can be very varied. The nature of gender expression and fluidity is not as straightforward as perhaps these categories I've mentioned earlier, these more common categories, would suggest. Whilst the majority might identify with one of those, there are a lot of people like me who don't really seem to be able to identify with anybody else we hear about online. There may be quite a lot that we do relate to in terms of what others in the trans community are saying, or non-binary community in general, communities, I should say. But when we actually try to pin down people that have the same motivations, the same turn-ons, the same desires, the same seemingly very strange nature, according to sort of binary norms, and we can't find anyone else like ourselves online. That can be quite an isolating and lonely experience, and therefore I thought, well, it's time really for me to be open about this, and to hopefully, as a result of that, if others are tuning in, they may know, not necessarily likely they'll be like me, but that their own uniqueness or rareness, let's say, does occur. It doesn't mean that they are degenerate people. So I have put that in another video, partly also because it's not explicit, but it does probably does qualify for YouTube's 18 plus requirement. I didn't really want to put that out into the general domain. Now, this term transnormal, which I've coined for this particular video, to my knowledge, maybe I've heard it somewhere else, but to my knowledge, doesn't actually exist as a commonly understood term. A little search that I did on this term using Perplexity, the AI search engine, came back with this. The term transnormal is not a commonly used or recognized term in transgender discourse. And he went on to make the very valid point, I think, that it's important to note that being transgender is already a normal and valid identity. Transgender individuals are simply people whose gender identity differs from the sex they were assigned at birth. So the goal is not to create a separate category of normal for trans people, but rather to foster a society where all gender identities are respected and accepted without discrimination and stigma. So I think, as a kind of working definition of what I'm talking about, really, I'm really referring to any non-binary sexuality or identity that doesn't fully align with these common categories of being trans. So a trans woman, trans man, cross-dreamer, and, as I said, perhaps including also those who are born intersex, who identify as trans as well. It's a term not to be confused with trans normalcy, which refers to the acceptance and integration of transgender people as a regular part of society. So this is looking at things like having access to appropriate healthcare, legal protection against discrimination, social acceptance, and so on. There are, of course, a huge variety of terms describing people who identify as trans, or more broadly as genderqueer. As I saw it described in one online blog, this was actually a therapist's counseling or therapy blog. Gender is a spectrum with many possible expressions and experiences. Some examples, and here I would strongly refer you to the Cross-Dreamers glossary. The link for that is online, and using very briefly some of their definitions for just a few of these terms. Gender flux, so gender identity in which gender intensity varies over time. Gender fawn, this is gender fluidity, where someone goes through masculine genders to experiencing no gender at all, but never touches the feminine. Gender fey is the female equivalent there. Demigirl, a non-binary gender identity where one assigned female at birth feels only a weak connection with the idea of being a woman, vice versa for a male. That's the demi-guy. A neutoire, non-binary gender identity where one feels a separate gender from man or woman, in a similar way to how a person experiences a third gender, or they may feel a lack of gender or neutral gender altogether. It's not dissimilar to the idea of the androgyne, someone who lives without appearing or behaving as male or female. And just to give one more, transmen. This is quite a derogatory term, typically. A male to female transsexual who's also a lesbian. In other words, a transsexual woman who is sexually attracted to other women. So I have used the definitions there from the Crossdressers dictionary, which gives a very comprehensive list of many terms that fall under the trans umbrella, a non-binary umbrella, many, many beyond this. So I would recommend you take a look at that. Recent surveys, and this is according to good old Wikipedia, show a variety of sexual orientations among trans people. These include between 20 and 24% of trans respondents identifying as being gay, 18% identifying as pansexual, between 16 and 23% identifying with the terms gay, lesbian, or same gender loving, 15 to 19% heterosexual, 14 to 25% bisexual, and 6 to 10% asexual. So quite a lot of variety there. Orientation, of course, being something very different to gender identity, gender expression, and presentation. Sexual orientation, too, can be fluid. It is in my case, and it can change over time. There certainly are reports of people who have transitioned, changing their orientation, perhaps unexpectedly. And again, according to Wikipedia, a 2013 study found that close to 60% of transgender and gender non-conforming people that responded to the survey experience changes in their sexual attraction during their lives. So if we combine potential fluidity, a strong or weak association with a gender, how we want to identify and express ourselves, our sexual orientation, not to mention the notion of this, how do we define it universally, if ever we can, gender spectrum, how we can describe ourselves can be very varied. Facebook, and I'm not sure if this is changing now because there are some quite significant policy changes that have been announced around the time I'm making this video, not in a very favorable way in terms of protecting minority groups like trans people against hate speech, as far as I can see. But certainly in recent years, Facebook offered around 50 different identities that you could choose from in setting up a profile. So someone might say, I'm gender questioning, non-binary, asexual. Another, call me two-spirit, non-conforming. And still another, just to give another example. And this was something I pulled offline. I identify as a cisgender gay male of trans experience. And this is before we get into the territory of what pronouns people relate to and want to be known by. I won't get into that debate here. It's clearly something which is quite controversial for some. Now, I'm not sure how I would describe myself. That's really why I put this other video together, if you're interested. And it's something I'm very rarely asked. But it would probably be something like a gender fluid, male-bodied person of flexible body preference and variable but weak orientation, sexual orientation. So my goodness, that's quite a mouthful, isn't it? It doesn't quite easily lend itself to any one of those one-word definitions that we came up with there. And there's quite a bit more, actually, as you'll see or you'll hear if you watch my longer video on this. In other words, it's complex for many of us. Finally, though, for now, what might I say to binary folk out there, and possibly also some others within the trans community who might not appreciate the extent of variety, people like myself who don't quite fit into one of these boxes that I mentioned earlier. Yes, of course, there's going to be overlap. I am a cross-dresser or a cross-dreamer. At times, I would consider myself to be a trans woman, but I'm kind of moving between those categories. I can't just define myself as one of those. And that covers really my identity and my sexuality. That's why it's complex. So what would I say to such folk? Well, recognizing the variety of experience, that this is real. And that's really why I put this video and a number of others together on this subject. It's persistent, it's existential for those of us who do experience this. So being open to learning about the true lives of others, just hearing their stories, possibly even from folks you may know, would be something that I would recommend. You may be surprised and it may be enlightening. Be compassionate, of course, and not fearing or judging people whose behavior, their natures seem so different, so alien, what you might consider to be aberrant or even perverse. They are likely very nice people, especially if you do know them already. You probably know that. Gentle souls, good people like yourself, I'm sure. And not using your own experiences, this particularly is if you're in the trans community, as a kind of yardstick to measure others, to say, well, you should be in this category or you should be in that. Not all dysphoria either is seen. Much is suppressed. That's particularly the case with body dysphoria, I think. And a lot of intersex and trans people may hide aspects of their sexuality for fear of rejection and abuse. That can go on pretty much for a lifetime for some people. So, bottom line, the nature of trans people's sexualities, when we're considering this broad umbrella, is very broad, much more so than being binary. And in addition, it can also be fluid. So this is a different world, I guess, if you are binary, to try and understand. All I can say is that from my own experience, it's very real. And as I say, maybe there will be others. I will try and add some if I come across others' testimonies like my own in a dedicated playlist on this channel. I think it'd be very worthwhile to hear their experiences as a way of helping to broaden our minds on this fascinating topic.